Welcome back to the Collaborative Journalism Summit. I'm Stephanie Murray. I'm the director of the Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State University, and I am so thrilled to welcome you to this discussion. The next conversation that we're hosting here is one that I've been eagerly awaiting. And I'm very grateful to the Len-Fest Institute for Journalism for sponsoring this conversation about building just and equitable partnerships, journalism partnerships, in service of a shared, reimagined future. I'd like to welcome Roxann Stafford to the stage. I'm overjoyed and humbled to welcome Roxann Stafford to our stage to share this space with us, and she'll be hosting this conversation. Roxann is Managing Director of the Knight-Lenfest Local News Transformation Fund, and she will be leading us through the next hour together. So Roxann, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I'm thrilled to be here in company and in community with all of you. Thank you to the Collaborative Journalism Summit team and all of you who are tuning in and doing this most important work. I also extend gratitude and acknowledgement to the Indigenous lands we are gathering from and to the ancestral wisdom that is guiding us. As Stephanie shared, my name is Roxann Stafford, and I'll give you all a little bit of a taste of what the Knight-Lenfest Local News Transformation Fund is before we jump into this conversation. We are an independent joint initiative of the Knight Foundation and the Len-Fest Institute, designed to strengthen local journalism at scale with a focus on journalistic excellence and serving the information needs of communities in the US. The Knight-Lenfest Fund, our framing is really around a mutual aid approach to journalism. And we'll get into some of that today with a focus on the relationship between sustainability and equity in our national as well as in our local work in Philadelphia. So when science fiction author Octavia Butler was once asked for advice on predicting the future, she said, "There is no single answer that will solve all of our future problems. There is no magic bullet. Instead, there are thousands of answers. At least you can be one of them if you choose to be." Now, as we continue to learn more about the ways in which we'll be living in the pandemic and continue to do the important and paramount work of accountability and reconciliation to address racism and systemic inequalities, we're going to be seeing lots of different ways that news and information and partnerships will be created, communicated, and lived. So I am so honored to be here speaking with 4 people who, in the words of Octavia Butler, chose to bring an equitable, just, and Stephanie, if I may add another word, joyful future into the now. Please join me in welcoming such an amazing group. Candice Fortman, Executive Director of Outlier Media. Chris Norris, Managing Editor for Community Engagement at WHYY and WHYY N.I.C.E, News and Information Community Exchange. Eric Marsh, the Community Outreach Organizer at WHYY N.I.C.E. And Mitra Kalita, CEO, co-founder of URL Media and publisher of Epicenter, N.I.C.E. So to kick this off, maybe we can just quickly go around and each of you can briefly introduce yourself as you describe your news organization and initiative, and also answer this question: what do just, equitable, and joyful partnerships mean to you?
Where would you like to start?
Candice, would you mind kicking us off since I named you first, if that's okay?
Yes, sorry. Hey everyone, I'm Candice Fortman with the extreme honor of being Executive Director of Outlier Media here in Detroit, Michigan. And Outlier is a service-based journalism organization that focuses on the needs of low-wealth Detroiters. We do that in several ways, but I think the one that is most well-known is through our SMS text message system. And we do that also by first asking Detroiters, what are their highest information needs? What do they need to know today in order to survive in Detroit? Mm-hmm. That word survival is really important because so much of the information that is available to all of us in the many ways that it's available is about really thriving, right? So the folks that we work with really need to be able to survive in the moment that they're in, and that is what we do. And I have to say that there is no outlier without partnership. Our entire model is partnership-based. We are fortunate to be able to work with almost every newsroom in Detroit and many newsrooms across the country. And that in and of itself gives me joy, that the center of our power does not exist only in our newsroom, but it exists in newsrooms across this city, across this state, and across this country. And Roxann, you and I have talked a lot about what I have been learning from Kwanzaa and what I am trying to put into our work here at Outlier. And I'm really trying to get back to a village-minded mindset.
Yes.
And we are starting to put together the feet and grounding of Outlier. This is a village newsroom. This newsroom belongs to no one but the people it serves. And so that gives me joy also. And I'm just really grateful that I get to be here on this panel with you all today and get to talk about my favorite subject in the world.
I love it. Thanks, Candice. I know we'll be getting deeper into what does it mean to have a village mindset as we move forward. Chris, love to hear from you, and then Eric about what you all have been up to in Philly.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Norris. I also go by Flood the Drummer or just Flood, and I'm the managing editor of community and engagement at WHYY. We are the local NPR and PBS affiliate. And our newest initiative or project or program is the News and Information Community Exchange. It's a mutual aid journalism collaborative that organizes, supports, and develops grassroots content creators that are already serving their neighborhoods with timely news and information. The reason I'm excited about N.I.C.E, other than the really cool acronym and logo, is that it represents what the future of journalism is and should be for many areas, because we're not focusing on platforms as much as we're focusing on people. We're not focusing on algorithms as much as we're focusing on access. We're not focusing on clicks as much as we're focusing on community. The guiding principle of N.I.C.E is that our audience can also be our collaborators, and that communities aren't just consumers of news and information, but providers of it too. And so we center and value the lived experience as expertise, juxtaposed to just centering academic attainment. And we recognize that our community partners are not our competitors. They are an added value that enhance our journalism. They provide us a pipeline to original story sources and original programming, and they carry us on their backs because they built up the trust.
There you go. All right. Already dropping these truth bombs left and right. I love it. I love it. Eric, I know you're part of the N.I.C.E community. Can you share a little bit about your role? And again, what does an equitable, just, and joyful partnership mean to you?
Well, first, thank you, Roxann. Thank you for that introduction, and thanks for Chris. I don't know how to follow up what he just shared because he pretty much just said it all, right? I oversee the News and Information Community Exchange, as Chris said. And I think that to answer your question about just, equitable, and joyful partnerships, I think N.I.C.E is the epitome of it. One of our partners, Emma Restrepo, has said multiple times that N.I.C.E is a family, right? As a small content creator, a grassroots broadcaster, she often refers to our group as her family because she says it's never before in her career outside of a major newsroom has she been able to be in the same room with like-minded individuals. And all of the partners have kind of have reiterated that sentiment, that not only do they get a sense of community while at the same time serving their community, but they get an understanding of the landscape from a different perspective because they're in the same room at the same table with so many individuals. And honestly, I feel like our part at WHYY is the smallest part. We simply facilitate the conversation, bringing these individuals together. And I'm going to steal an analogy that an old friend of mine uses all the time, and that is, our partners represent hydrogen and oxygen, and we're just bringing them together to make water. They're making something that they've never been able to make individually. And by bringing them together, it's just creating something new and something that's life-affirming and life-giving. So I feel fortunate and blessed to be able to facilitate these conversations with our partners.
I love the molecular analogy mixed in there. I'm seeing folks doing shout outs in the chat. Please drop your questions, thoughts, and shout outs, because we're getting into this. We may not be able to be around the same kitchen table, but we're definitely feeling the energy from each other. And Mitra, I'm so glad to have you pull up a seat to our kitchen table. Please share with us. You are doing so many incredible things with URL Media, as well as Epicenter N.I.C.E. Shout out to Epicenter N.I.C.E, because you all helped me help other people get vaccinated. So I appreciate all that you are doing.
I'm so happy to hear that, Roxann. Well, I'll start with Epicenter and then shift to URL, except that as we talk for the next hour or so, you will hear that there is so much overlap, and that's precisely the point. Epicenter launched in the summer of 2020. I live in Jackson Heights, Queens, one of the hardest hit areas by the pandemic. And it just felt like we literally felt abandoned here. It was ambulance sirens, who is looking out for us, and just community started to swap to kind of what Eric's analogy of, it was really just putting it together. Our communities were already swapping information that was, you know, equal parts survival, equal parts joy. Will I find yeast? Will I find, you know, what's the line at Patel Brothers like? Is there social distancing at the supermarket? Is there a hospital bed at Elmhurst, right? So it was just a overlay. And I think it's important to recognize that we often write, journalists are really good at going into tragedy, but the reality of how we both consume news as well as engage with each other is an overlap of tragedy and the seeking out of joy and happiness and fulfillment. And that really kind of got baked into our identity when we launched initially as a newsletter. It grew pretty quickly. I mean, the early days of the newsletter, like I would consider it a victory. Speaking of mutual aid approaches, if the local food bank said, hey, Mitra, we got 6 shipments of the size 4 diapers that we were in shortage of. And I would, you know, again, coming from CNN, which is where I worked before, you know, 6 is nothing, but for Epicenter, 6 was a revolution, right? And so I kept leaning into that type of feedback to direct us. And at the same time, Sarah Lomax-Reese, who's been a friend of mine for years, and we have a lot of Philly in the house today, I know, the president of WHYY, Philadelphia's Black Talk radio station, we had just been comparing notes because she's so wise and my friend. So why wouldn't I turn to her as I'm launching Epicenter? And it dawned on me that the same reason people trust us and love us, arguably, is that we're small and intimate, and we're exactly engaged in the type of exchanges that, you know, my co-panelists have spoken about way more eloquently. And yet we are up against Google, Amazon, Facebook. We are up against these behemoths that make it impossible to build sustainable businesses. And so we said, if we band together, can we try? So I want to admit we are trying. We soft launched URL Media right after inauguration. That was intentional. And our messaging was the next 4 years cannot look like the last 4 or the last 400. And so we are centering Black voices. It is a very important part of our identity. While we are for Black and brown media outlets, even the work at Epicenter, as we did the vaccine outreach that Roxann is alluding to, we learned very quickly that if you center Black New Yorkers to get their vaccines, guess what? The lady on the Upper East Side, the white lady, benefits too. In fact, many of them benefit. And so we started to use that approach. And so the reason I say you can't really separate, in some ways, the ethos of our outlets is very much what has been described here. URL Media is 8 partners right now. We share content and advertising revenue, and then you're hopefully seeing us increasingly making appearances on NPR and PBS, and just trying to get those stories to redefine the mainstream. That is a big part of our identity. I'll just segue to that joy of collaboration, which is
please.
the ethos of URL. It's amazing to work with people who come from different backgrounds, and yet we were all raised in a very similar way, where it's not like anyone was especially wealthy, but we always had extra food on the table for people who showed up. we always had people sleeping in our basements. And so, or in my case, sometimes on the floor of my bedroom. And we just come from backgrounds that we're literally creating community as a part of our own upbringings. To work with people like that in journalism allows us to redefine journalism in a collaborative.
There you go.
And it's not about beating each other and kind of, if you think about the way that mainstream newsrooms talk about each other, it's the competition, right? And we don't see each other that way. Like, I cannot tell you how much joy that brings me, because it's coming from a place of inclusivity. You can't talk about diversity and inclusivity if you don't practice that as a strategy. And so, and then the last thing I'll say that has been an intentional joy creation is Epicenter's last word of our newsletter. Literally the last word is always an artist. And I believe that artists and our community members, especially over the last year, are an integral part of just even us rethinking our formats of information, as well as making sure that we intentionally make the last word. Like, after, Epicenter is going to tell you how hard it is to get a vaccine, that stuff is really messed up. There's institutional forces against you. But if we can leave on a piece of artwork that brings you joy, and by the way, we pay those artists, then I feel like it starts to create a movement that also centers joy to some extent.
I love that, Mitra. It's so connected to what you all were all sharing, right? This shared ethos, whether we talk about it from a village concept or a molecular, like bringing together of H2O, it's all defining what we mean by mutual aid. And I love you bringing up the point that artists have to be a part of this process. Creative folks are definitely essential. And Eric, that makes me think about some of the stuff that you've been talking about, specifically with the N.I.C.E community, and how we need to work on different ways in which we approach partnership, such that we're moving beyond traditional news organization ways and really thinking about how do we bring people together and honoring their true lived experience. And so I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about how that's been happening with N.I.C.E, given the fact that you do have artists and creative folks who are essential to how you all get information out as a collective.
No, thank you for that. Yeah, I think the way that we do that is, one, by reminding them and recognizing that they are professionals when they walk in the room, right? And so this idea of grassroots, quote unquote, community, it's very easy to, all of these terms come with their own history and labels. And so it's very easy to fall into the habit of diminishing someone when you say community or grassroots, right? Because traditional mainstream media has this reputation of kind of Ivy League status in a way, right? And so we want to really just put all of that to the side and speak to the professionalism and the dedication that people bring in their commitment to serve news and information to their communities. And reminding these partners, which we do in every single time that we reach out to someone, is that it's their work that they've already been doing in the community that made us even recognize them, and what they were doing made us even reach out to them and say, hey, what you're doing is worthy and it's valuable, and we would like you to come and share with us. Not in a manipulative kind of way where this is a top-down hierarchical kind of relationship, but it's really about, we have something that we can share together, something that we can build together from an equal footing. And I don't want to be the one to come up with all of these the analogies and cliches, but I'm gonna do it, right?
We're ready for it. Bring it.
Our VP, Sandy Clark, has used this analogy of we no longer want to give this concept of like people want a piece of the pie, right? People want to be in the kitchen with you when you're baking the pie and making sure that the flavors that they love are the things that are being included in it, and that they have a hand in the creation of it, right? And so understanding from that concept that it's not this thing that we're trying to put together and serve to others. It's really a way of growing holistically as a community and saying we've recognized value, that everyone has value and everyone should be sharing their own stories and telling their own stories. And we just want to facilitate that process.
Thank you. I know there are folks listening and tuning in, they're holding their hands up and saying, that's what I believe in and that's what I work on. And it connects so nicely to what you were saying, Mitra, about how your household was designed and is designed. Folks may be sleeping on the floor. Folks might be coming over, right, to borrow the Wi-Fi to do their homework, right? You have to build the muscle memory in order to be able to do this. This is not a thing that just happens. People need to know your house is a house that is open, so to speak, if we're living in this metaphor world, right? They need to know they can come into the kitchen and bake that pie, as you always say, Chris and Sandy and Eric. Shout out to Sandy Clark, of course. Candice, I want to quickly go back to the village concept, because I feel you were nodding the whole entire time as both Mitra was breaking down her home life and connection to how that manifests in her work, and how Eric was throwing down another analogy. Can you help us feel the power of the village and what we need to do to be able to be in the village?
Yeah, I literally wrote down on this Post-it note all of the words that people were saying that were interconnected, and this idea that we're all talking about the same thing. And so much of that comes from how we were raised. So when we talk about diversity, we're talking about the importance of the mindset that comes with people who were raised differently. And so growing up in Detroit, my mother was Block Club president. And so she was Block Club president most of my life, quite honestly. And so I have been serving a community before I knew what service was, before I understood what community was. I just knew that what my mother told me to do, we would go work the polls, we would throw a back to school fair.
There you go.
Neighborhood. When we got a computer and we were the first family on the block with a computer, she made me make a newsletter. We didn't call it a newsletter. She called it a flyer, because they had changed the trash day. And she said, hey, get on a computer and tell people they've changed the way they're picking up trash. She was a good editor in that way. She's very bossy. All of that has taught me how to do this job. I didn't know I was being trained to do a job.
There you go.
I was just doing what my mother told me to do. I was doing what the community raised me to do. And so when I get to last year at JSK, and I wrote my very first piece, and Dawn opened it up and she said, I don't hear you at all in this piece. I could have read this in the Wall Street Journal. Where's Candice? I assumed, since I was at Stanford, nobody wanted to hear from Candice. People wanted to hear from a higher version of myself, right? And she said, no, we didn't bring that person here. We brought Candice here. I want to hear Detroit. I want to hear the person I knew. And that is how I got to the piece about faith is not a business plan, right?
All right.
Directly from like the lessons I got in that Baptist church on the west side of Detroit. Those things teach me every single day how to do this job. And as I lean more and more into those village principles, more and more to the way that my community raised me, the people who got me to this place, more and more those small lessons in some Bible school in the back of a hot church in Detroit in the summer, I am becoming better at being able to lead a newsroom that thinks about the collective, that wants the collective to be a part of it. And that part is really hard, because that is not how this industry is set up, especially businessmen. There is no reward in operating that way. However, when I see what we're able to build with our friends at Detour Detroit, our friends at Planet Detroit, what we're working on, how we're re-envisioning the future of journalism, even on the business side of how we do this work, it is the only thing that keeps me here. Because if I had to operate under the systems that typically govern journalism, I probably would have left long before I ever got to Outlier. And so the thing that keeps me going, and I think probably the folks on this panel as well, is that I am envisioning a new future. The future doesn't look like it does, like the present does. And it is the only way I can continue to do this work. And I honestly believe it's the only reason our audience believes in us, because they believe we can build something better than what they've been handed thus far.
Yeah, Candice, thank you. I know we're getting some amens and hey from people tuning in around this. And I would say that all of you present are helping people realize that we can live in that future now. We just need to be brave enough call upon experiences that we have had and honor them along with honoring everyone around us. That reminds me of something that Chris, you often talk about in this larger context around committing acts of journalism and that connection to, again, the lived experience. I was wondering if you could share with folks who haven't heard you, so to speak, give a sermon about committing acts of journalism. If you could break that down for folks.
Sure. I mean, I think we all know from, just we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. And the reason that case became what it was is because there was a brave young woman who committed an act of journalism. When we think about many of the cases of police killings that have materialized and emerged as hashtags, we know of them because individuals were brave enough to commit acts of journalism. And what the industry traditionally hasn't done was value those who commit acts of journalism. They only valued the journalist. And the idea that citizens who live in their neighborhoods, who tell stories for and with and about their neighborhoods, don't have the same level of cachet, trust, and equity that someone who parachutes in their neighborhood to tell a story does, is the main problem. There is a power and a perception problem with journalism. And the perception is that there are certain people who get to tell a story for others. There's an elite group, a handful of the chosen few, who gets to tell a story from the ivory tower, and they can go into a neighborhood and tell a story and then go back out. And then the people who live there, who tell these stories, who have the trust, they are seen as being too close to communities, as being not able to be objective. When in the truth, that whole conversation of objectivity in journalism I won't start on that today. But that's a whole.
You can break down anything you want, Chris. You can break it all down. Here we go.
And me, that's a whole problem, because many journalists get into the business because they feel passionate about a subject, and they pitch to their editors again and again that they want to chase this investigation or they want to chase this story because it matters to them. And so it's not an objective. No one's taking objective, because if you were objective, you just take whatever story someone gives you and you write that story. So the idea that there is objectivity in mainstream journalism is a myth, but it's used as a way to devalue community-centered journalism, because we use the lack of objectivity as code word for lack of professionalism. And that's, I think, what we're doing differently at WHYY, is that we are centering those people who commit acts of journalism in ways that are as nuanced as creating social media broadcast, and as basic as producing flyers and newsletters for a certain type of community. All of that stuff has value. There's a reason why when you watch the big stories, the big protests, the big police shootings, there's a reason why it's not NBC 10 and CBS that has that camera footage, right? It's because they can't get into those rooms. They can't get into those spaces, and certain people won't talk to them. And so they find the people on Twitter who have that video, and they credit them. And those people commit acts of journalism, and the industry doesn't recognize them and the value that they bring, but we do. At WHYY, I think we intentionally talk about expertise in a myriad of ways, and it's not just centered in academic attainment. It's centered in lived experience, and the people that are closest to the problem should be the ones to help you inform it. They should be the ones that help you think about it. And so, again, I go back to one of the guiding philosophies, is that our audience can also be our collaborators, and that in itself is pursuing the future of journalism, because the future of journalism is always talked about in the context of platforms and algorithms, and very rarely do you get to hear about people, right? And so the future of journalism is people.
The future is always people. I love that, Chris, and that cultivation of understanding that begins at home, as both Mitra and Candice reminded us. I want to keep going down this path, because I think it's really, really important that we have to be able to address coded bias, literally coded, right? As well as the big codes, the laws, the policies that perpetuate this bias. And I want to talk about this also in terms of the business or revenue model structure, right? I know I've had conversations with you all about this, and I want to bring more people into this, because I think sometimes we think about bias on the quote unquote content community side, but we don't think about the structural inequalities that force us into certain business constructs or into certain revenue models. Mitra, I'm wondering if you could kick that off. And then I know,
Sure.
Candice, that is something dear to your heart that you've been working on as a JSK fellow as well.
So I'll give you like it's not a secret, but we've been in intense brainstorming around the membership model for Epicenter, and it speaks to exactly what you just outlined. And also some key learnings from what y'all were talking about in terms of audience interactivity and engagement. So what do I mean by that? So I think there's like a classic membership model of like $5 a month, paywalls. Like these are all things that we've almost taken for granted, to the extent that when I say I'm going to do a membership program, people just are like, oh, you're going to have to log in to get Epicenter content. And I think what we are doing there is mistaking our value to communities as just articles, maybe videos. And you can't separate the lack of digital disruption in mainstream newsrooms from the lack of diversity, because we continue to be in these very linear formats of consumption, when anyone who spent any time in Jackson Heights or any of our communities can tell you, no, people are not reading articles on websites, thank you very much, right? So that was an important kind of like step back on what's our business model and the membership program. So what we've decided is that our content will be free. At least this is like iteration. I'll come back in a year and tell you if it's still the case. Our content will be free. Convening feels like something people want to pay for. So what do we mean by that? Me giving you a food tour of Queens is going to be the best damn food tour that you can go on. I mean, we know that, right? Like,
Yes.
And so, can we charge for that? My husband who's an artist, taking you to art galleries that are undiscovered and kind of off the beaten path, worth paying for. Now, how do we continue to be inclusive? Do we allow some folks that are in the free model? Do we have a lottery system for people who don't have to pay for those things? We're still figuring that out. So that's like one bucket, but I think this idea of content being what people pay for, it can be misguided, because we need to be a little bit more expansive. And for us, it really is this idea of gathering, discussing, and then this gets to where you've interacted with Epicenter on the vaccine front. Our volunteers, we have dozens of people who want to be a part of the future of New York City. And so we feel like we've been able to unlock some really interesting network models of, here's a news story, there's a group of people in need as a part of it. Can we, as our first response to this, not just stick a microphone in your face and ask how you're feeling, but figure out what are the resources you need?
Yeah.
And guess what? We actually become people keep turning to us and giving us better stories as a result, right? So that's one thing. Another bucket is philanthropy. It would be, we are a for-profit organization, so is URL Media. It would be remiss of me to not acknowledge the role of philanthropy in getting us to this place. And some of that is funding reporting, funding community management, just getting us out of the gate. And I want to acknowledge that. The third is advertising. We've landed advertising deals both for Epicenter and for URL Media. I think one of the kind of bittersweet messages to come out of 2020 was forcing businesses to put their money in BIPOC and local media. And so that has been a response that makes us still see a model with advertising. I feel like I'm not answering one of your questions.
No, you're good. You're breaking it. You're helping people understand.
Okay, I just wasn't sure if there was another one that you had tacked in there. Okay.
Oh, you're good. And
yeah.
I love what you talked about in terms of networks. Again, as we're using a part of this time to talk about business models and revenue models, we know it's important to have a sustainable competitive advantage, right? As we are working on our ventures on our own, or as even part of a larger organization. And one of the most powerful sustainable competitive advantages is the network effect, right? And so that's what you were talking about, Mitra. And I want people to examine, what does the network effect, again, the multiplicity as more people come together, when we frame it in terms of a mutual aid approach and not an approach about raising more money for capitalistic gains. And so that's why I want to come back to you, Candice. You kicked us off with your introduction talking about the village model. And I think that's a way for us to start to think newly about network effects as it relates to sustainable competitive advantage. Not to say capital is bad, but right, we're moving for more things. We're a yes and group. So please break it down.
It helps. And so I'm gonna get real right now.
Here we are. Let's do it.
Okay, so for the first two, I've been at Outlier now for a little over 2 years. I started in February of 2019. And I know how much money was in the bank account the day we started. And it wasn't a whole lot. And so I know what it has taken to get us from that day to a place where we're able to hire. It is not enough for Outlier to succeed alone. We need the other organizations that exist in this ecosystem to be as strong and even stronger than we, which means that we have to think about any investment that we have gotten and how do we make space for other organizations that exist, that we work with, that we learn from, that we thrive with, to be able to learn from how we receive those investments, but more importantly, how do we double down on those investments? Right? So when we look at, I was talking about Kwanzaa because I just wrote a piece about this, and we look at that principle of cooperative economics, right?
There you go. Yes.
This is when I start to reach down into my actual roots and say, what can I learn from my own experience as a Black woman in America that can help me lead an ecosystem into a better way of being? We talk a lot about collaboration on the editorial side, and clearly I'm a big champion and proponent of that. We have to talk more about it on the business side. I think Mitra and Sarah are doing is revolutionary. It is what we have to do in order to survive. And so we're starting to talk in Detroit in a really small group about what it means for us to join together and to start to do the same thing they're doing at URL on the revenue side. How do we start to go after local dollars together? How do we build sales principles together? And shout out to Ashley Woods, who I know is on this call right now from Detour Detroit, because she has been so wonderful in being a partner with me on this, because I don't have a colleague on the business side at Outlier. She is my colleague. She will consistently be my colleague even when I do have somebody on the business side. But we are really thinking about how do we grow our organizations, not as competitors, but together. How do we start to go up that hill together? It is the only way any of us will make it. And more importantly, we are all preparing for a future where there aren't two daily papers operating in Detroit. In order for us to be ready for our communities to still have information and news as a service, we have to get stronger. And the only way we can get stronger is together.
Well, Candice, I love all the sermons we're getting, all the mic drops. And speaking of futures, right? I'm curious, before we have an opportunity to open it up to folks who have been, thank you, popping it off in chat with their questions, and please continue to add them. If each of you can just share, this discussion is about us reimagining a shared future. Right? Not just any future, but a shared future. If each of you could just briefly share with us what you think that shared future is. I know we've gotten glimpsed a bit in this conversation, but just to round it out. Eric, would you like to start?
Thank you. Yeah, I think we've seen over the past year what a shared future could look like, both good and bad, right? The pandemic has shown us that we are a collective body, right? We're not just a group of individuals doing their own thing, out here. We are globally a living organism. We're all interconnected, right? And so the pandemic obviously showed us that on a negative side, but this idea of mutual aid and the way communities and individuals have stepped up to support one another and to support folks who are from very different backgrounds and different demographics, right? And don't necessarily look like you, right? That's also what the future looks like. And I think by understanding that, by us going through this process, we've been forced to look at our humanity and look at what's important to all of us collectively and individually. And we see that mutual aid, helping one another. I'm just going to keep saying stuff. There's an African proverb, right?
All right.
Rain does not fall on one roof alone, right? There's nothing that happens to my neighbor that does not in some way impact me. And so I think this is the future, us understanding this from a human perspective, and then maturing into the ability to work together and work collaboratively. For me, that's what the future looks like.
Well, and we'll get into, I know in the questions, because I'm already seeing them come up, what does that maturation process look like? So thanks for teeing that up, Eric. Mitra, what is your reimagined shared future for us?
So I think it's, this is going to sound weird. It's like a understanding from our partners that this is a long game, because while URL certainly says we could solve your diversity problem tomorrow because our partners have the content that outlets need, right? So that's like a framing that we'll use. On the other hand, we deal with many, many people who recognize they have a massive problem on their hands, and it's been hundreds of years in the making. And so just this commitment to a long game is something I long for, and yet, to be super honest with you, I'm somewhat skeptical of. And so I think a lot of us feel this urgency right now to work. Like you're seeing this from my peer group of journalists of color. We're working our asses off because we feel the pressure of this moment, because we don't trust the system to be there, not just 10 years from now, but 1 year from now. I don't know if all the advertisers lining up right now are going to be there in a year. And so guess what I'm doing? Until 3 in the morning, I am sending them every proposal I can, because I don't have that cushion to not do that, right? And so my dream for this future would be almost an embrace of this as a way of doing the work, and all of us doing the work. And somebody mentioned in one of the chats, just the nature of collaboration requires resources. And for us just to acknowledge that, because working together, and like that image we have of extra food at the table, even as I said it, I'm like, well, I'm very nostalgic about it. You know who might not be? My mother, who had to cook it. Somebody had to do that work, right?
There was labor.
There is labor involved. So I think that's another part of our future, and acknowledging that and supporting that and sustaining it.
Thank you. And again, there are questions coming up that want to explore more of like, how do we do the honoring of the labor correctly? And also, how do we think about time differently? You all might recall that as we kicked off this panel, we did an acknowledgement of our Indigenous lands, as well as our ancestral scholarship and wisdom, because we know that, you know, this isn't a season of the month kind of thing if we are truly going to get to the places that all of you all have shared. Candice, I want to jump over to you. If you could briefly share what your reimagined shared future is.
People are the center of that future. The people who who do this work, the people we are served and who do this work with us. But also, I just want to say, go back to the past for 1 second. We are moving so rapidly through 2021. Remember what it felt like in April of 2020 to live anywhere in this world. We were all stuck in an information gap. Every single person, regardless of race, creed, how much money you had in the bank, you had a need for information. Now, remember what it would feel like to live like that all the time. That feeling, I don't want anyone to feel that going forward. I don't want a future where people feel like they are constantly in a tornado where they can't figure out how to get from A to B. That is the future I am trying to solve for every single day. And I think it is the future that requires us to center people and to build for and with people as if we honor their presence and their intelligence.
There you go. Honor is that key you all talked about earlier, the notion of value. I know folks in the chat want to explore, like, how do we make sure that we see that humanity and value from the get-go versus trying to match it to a false reality. And Chris, if you don't mind, can you take us home before we transition into the questions about your reimagined shared future for us?
Sure. I know we're short on time. I'll be very brief. I think, you know, our shared future is emphasizing the word share and making sure that we share our platforms and we share our wisdom. I truly believe in the concept of a cognitive surplus. that we're all individually really good and really talented on our own, but when we come together with our wisdom, our experiences, our talents, and our resources, we can make something much bigger than any of us could ever imagine. And so I'd like to see that shared future in this industry include a very intentional skill transference and transference of human capital across city and country line, across city and state lines, and acknowledging that the issues that Philadelphia is dealing with, in terms of gun violence, and the answers and the insight and the context that's needed to tell those stories and to come up with solutions are the same exact answers being asked in Atlanta and Baltimore and Detroit and Compton and Watts and parts of Texas. And so that we don't become so focused on local news that we forget that we're all a part of an ecosystem, and that even if we're telling a story from Philadelphia, there are lessons to learn from Baltimore, and there are lessons to learn from Detroit, and that it is not less local to reach out and get voices from Detroit to tell a story in Philadelphia.
There you go. Beautiful. I want to quickly build on all the futures that you shared by uplifting a couple of questions that came into our Q&A chat. And I know folks have been answering some of them along the way. One of those questions is around how do we get these messages, right? These shared futures, these approaches that you all are doing on the ground, these truths, as this attendee said, in front of more people, in front of more, as they put it, quote unquote, mainstream media. What things do we need to do, folks?
I'll start, and I'll say what we need to do is make sure that we are forcing the conversation in spaces where people feel uncomfortable, right? We have to disrupt the comfort of the status quo, because again, I think as you see, and again, I'll say again, it took a pandemic to shake up the system, right? And so now that people have shifted, we're at a crossroad. And so we have to make sure that we continue to keep our foot on the pedal and amplify the voices of those folks who are standing on a corner with their camera, who are capturing George Floyd being murdered. We're amplifying the names of individuals who are willing to go out and raise an alarm around the things that are impacting our societies and our communities. And we have to make sure that we engage in conversation with the gatekeepers, right? Folks who have the keys to these legacy news organizations, and make sure that we are in constant conversation, because we're in constant struggle and tension. So how can we form those conversations, create those conversations that broaden people's minds and perspectives and really show how we are connected? Because there are some folks that are strictly concerned about the business of this all, right? And it feels great to be kind of kumbaya-ish, right? But there are some bills that still need to be paid. And how can we speak to those individuals as well? One of the first things that we did inside of N.I.C.E, when we brought folks together, was recognize that, hey, we're coming out of a pandemic and a lot of people have impacted negatively financially. So what do? We put them in contact with our grant writer. We put them in contact with financial managers. We put them in contact with people that can help them remain sustainable, so that then we can continue to have this conversation. So I think that's something we have to do, is just continue to keep our foot on the gas and push these conversations in uncomfortable places.
Thank you. And I just want to lift up what you just said, Eric, because you all are a part of a legacy organization. I appreciate you all saying, hey, look, like, we ourselves have contributed to things, so we ourselves also have to be just as active and doing the right part of the process of reconciliation, repair, restoration, all the re's we know that are so important during this part of this time. Mitra, I know you jumped into the Q&A chat and talked a little bit about this, but for folks who haven't had a chance to get over there, would you mind sharing a bit of your reflections on that same question?
I come at this from a place where I do, similar to what Eric just said, feel like we do need these partners. We do need the mainstream media. Again, we are trying to redefine the mainstream media, right, to be inclusive. So there's two things that have been redeeming for me in this journey. One is when newsrooms or former colleagues themselves come to me and say, why couldn't you do this at all the organizations you worked for before? And I've worked at some really deep-pocketed organizations, CNN, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Quartz, the LA Times. And so I just think by asking that question, it's definitely forcing a reflection of the industry on how do we create opportunities for innovation and this type of community journalism inside organizations without doing like 65 memos and 6 years of planning, right? The second that has been also redeeming is mainstream newsrooms saying, come and talk either to our newsroom or, you know, in the case of NPR, I go on WNYC every week, and Brian Laird takes, who's a very popular talk show host here, takes what we're doing at Epicenter and we do like a vaccine readout on the week. For me, that's invaluable, not just because of the quote unquote exposure that everyone says we always need, but because the mayor listens to Brian Laird. And if I'm trying to save our Black and brown people, I need the mayor to do what he's got to do to put the freaking right signs on the vaccine sites so that people know what's going on, or put them in other languages. And so for me, I'm fine using the mainstream pulpit as access. And I also have been able to leverage, I mean, this I think comes from my own background in being in media. It's allowed Epicenter to feel like we're punching above our weight and get, you know, interviews and get CVS and Walgreens to fix their policies in response to what we're unearthing. That's very important to effect change.
Yes. Absolutely. I know we are getting close to the end of time, but I just want to uplift one other question from Josie. Thank you so much. How can we collaborate to help funders demand of media that is, as you say, going to operate in this work, that honors, right, all the concepts and truths that you all have been dropping right here? What can we do to get these funders on board?
Well, I'll happily take that. I think one of our funders is on this call right now, maybe more than one. You have to manage your funders. There's a power imbalance that naturally exists, right? Money creates a power imbalance. Remove that power imbalance from your mind. That was some advice that someone gave me that really, truly helped me. The moment I started seeing myself as someone who needed to hunch into the room when I talked to funders and remove my own self-worth from the conversation, I realized that what I needed to explain to them is, what is the work of Outlier? What is the goal? What are we trying to accomplish? And how they can join us on that journey and also accomplish their mission, their goals, and see out the values that they have set in place as well. You have to be willing to lose perhaps some money. And I know that's hard, especially for those of us who are struggling to get $100,000 in the door. But I promise you that if you stick to your guns, and if you really are constantly saying the same thing, they're hearing the same thing. I'm not changing what I'm saying.
Right.
The ones that are aligned with what you are trying to accomplish will emerge, and you will get greater support than you ever could if you bow down to people who are unwilling to match you mission to mission.
Thank you. Now, this is so true. And I'm just going to say a couple of highlights from that one that you were dropping. The journey is a journey together. So we need to think about accompaniment. Like, how do we all together teach each other to get to these shared futures that we're talking about, right? And the fact that your personal integrity and your story, right? Again, what you all shared at the beginning about how you were raised. Who is your block captain? Who comes to your house for dinner, right? How you care for people in your family and your family. You know what I'm talking about, right? That type of sensibility is so key, right? And I appreciate, Candice, you being so vulnerable about the sacrifices associated with having to leave money on the table when that is not a home, a real home for you and your future. Friends, I know we can keep going on and on with this illustrative, amazing group. Please follow them and their work on all the social medias, all the @, right? Again, we just want to thank each of you for what you do to bring in a shared future. And I would be remiss not to close with this. Octavia Butler, and she said this: so be it, see to it. So off, keep running, you've got this, and please continue to connect with folks at this incredible conference. Looking forward to seeing you all in the street.